I'm so excited to be joined by Jennifer DeWitt on the podcast today. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I think that you do such interesting work that I think is overlooked and not valued. And it's so tough for us to learn how to communicate with our clients and our potential clients. So, why don't you tell our listeners what you do and about your business?
Sure. Yeah. So I am a copywriter. Specifically, I focus on a lot of website copy for my clients, although I've done all the different kinds of copy I feel like you can do in the online business space.
Uh-huh.
I've done websites and sales pages and sales emails and nurture emails and social and blogs and all the things.
Hmm.
If there's written words somewhere in the digital business space, I feel like I've written a version of them at some point.
Hmm.
But I really love focusing on, I do a lot of websites and sales pages right now. I also really help my clients because I do have some retainer clients and other project-based things that I do. I focus a lot on how to tell stories with your content and in your
Yeah.
copy as just a really genuine way that we can connect with our audiences and build that rapport and trust in a way that doesn't feel like salesy and icky. And I know, especially, I work with mostly female entrepreneurs and a lot of very customer centric, heart centered. They really care about the people that they're serving.
Hmm.
And those people tend to have a very hard time feeling like they can sell and promote because we
Hmm.
have this like conception that sales means it's icky or gross or manipulative or things like that, which
Hmm.
selling I like to think of as sharing, although we can sell in ways that are manipulative and gross, and
Hmm.
there are ways to do that. But I feel like storytelling is such a beautiful way to sell in a way that feels really good to us and feels
Hmm.
like we're building relationships versus trying to like shove promotions down someone's throat.
Yeah. I that's why I'm like so excited to talk to you about this because myself included, the people that I tend to work with are those heart-centered kind of folks. And I'm more of an introvert, and you have a really interesting perspective about how copywriting can be easier for introverts as well. But first, let's just set the stage for somebody who might not really think about copywriting or its importance. What are some of the misconceptions, or can you just give us like a copywriting 101
Yeah.
to set the stage?
Yeah. So copywriting sounds very like fancy and formal, but
Right.
copy and content is just anywhere that you have words in your
Hmm.
business, which is going to be, of course, like your website or your sales page. If you write an email, if you write social posts, all of those things include words, and that's your copy. I think that a lot of people get really nervous when creating content and writing things for their business. I hear a whole lot, I'm just not a good writer. I don't know how to write. And I think that copywriting is very different than the kind of writing that we're taught like in school. And I say this also as a former educator. I'm married to a high school English teacher. So like I fully get the academic side of writing
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah.
But when you're creating copy for your business, it's much more conversational. It doesn't
Hmm.
have to be super formal. There's all these like grammar rules that were hammered into you in school that don't really apply as much.
Hmm.
Yes, there is still grammar involved in creating copy, but there's also a lot of rules and things that you can break and play around with because you're really, in a lot of ways, writing how you speak
Hmm.
when it comes to copywriting,
Hmm.
especially depending on the nature of your business. But again, like most of the women that I work with are connecting with either other moms who are business owners or other moms in general, other women in general. And it's meant to be more of a let's have a conversation with someone than
Hmm.
a formal presentation of what you do.
Hmm. Yeah, and I have spent more than 2 decades in the legal industry. So, too, if you come from this industry that has its own way of writing and speaking, man, is that so hard to
Yeah, because
break.
it's so formal. Like people who
Yeah.
come out of corporate, out of legal, HR, there's so much,
Mhm.
it has to be very by the book and formalized.
Mhm.
And sure, there's that kind of writing in certain spaces in your business. If you're
Mhm.
creating contracts and things like that, is a
Mhm.
very formalized form of writing. But if you're writing a post for Instagram or an email to your list, that doesn't have to be super formal. And it probably shouldn't be because people
Right,
don't want to read
exactly.
that.
I know. I really definitely struggle with that for sure. So, can tell us more about storytelling. And I think that is such a great way to think about conveying what we want to talk to our audience about. So, how would talk about the power of storytelling and how it can, I know this is such a buzzword, help us show up more authentically.
Mhm. Yeah. So stories are just how we relate to each other as humans. That
Mhm.
is how we learn the best is through stories. We are going to retain something
Mhm.
so much more if we hear a story about it than if we just
Yeah.
hear a fact. I think it's something like you're 20 times more likely or 22 times more likely. I can't remember the exact statistic that you're going to retain a story over retaining just like a statistic or a fact alone, because it's just how our brains remember things. It's how we connect to things. There's all kinds of research about like when you're reading a story or when someone tells you a story, it boosts your serotonin levels. So you feel that connection to people. We think about you read stories to like your children or to, I was a teacher before I taught elementary school and I was an elementary school librarian for years. So like that storytelling thing is deep within me, but
Mhm.
you think about like just that connection that you feel when someone is reading to you or telling you something. But it doesn't like our stories that we tell in our business don't have to be follow the line of a picture book or some epic novel that like you're
Mhm.
not Tolkien trying to write the Lord of the Rings. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be that complicated. If you can sit across from your best friend or your partner or your sister or whoever it is and tell them what happened to you at Starbucks this morning or what your kid said yesterday after school, you can tell somebody a story. A story essentially has to have a hero, which is a very like educational sort of word. It has to have someone it's about.
Mhm.
And there has to be some kind of action happening, a problem to solve, a problem that was solved, and then some kind of resolution. What did you learn from that? What happened from that? And when
Mhm.
you're telling stories in your business, it can be all kinds of things. Like
Mhm.
it can be stories of things you've had happen with clients. It can be things going on in your life. It could be decisions you've made in your business. It also can be hypotheticals. Imagine if this is what your daily routine looked like. What if your morning started this way versus this way? And I think storytelling is a beautiful way to lean into possibility for how we're talking to people. What if this was possible for you? As
Mhm.
opposed to leaning into pain points and agitating pain. I hate, again,
Mhm.
we talked about authenticity as a buzzword. I feel like agitating pain is also a very marketing buzzword
Yeah.
phrase, and I really hate it. Like,
Yeah, I know you brought that up when we were coordinating this conversation, and that's a really interesting point because not only do you have these kind of concepts that you maybe need to unlearn about your writing that you've been taught, but we're also given these mixed messages in the online space about what's right and what's wrong. So, yeah, what is an alternative to maybe not focusing on that pain point? How can we approach that differently?
yeah, so I think again that goes back to possibility for people. Like,
And I love
yes,
that, by the way. That's like,
thank you. You have to acknowledge that people are struggling with something. Like
yeah.
people talk about knowing your audience's pain or their pain points. And yeah, you have to know where are they coming from? What problems are they having that I can help them solve, rather than focusing in on, you are probably feeling like this and this, you're overwhelmed, you're stressed, you don't know what to do about fill in the blank situation. Rather than hammering that home so much, you can instead shift the focus to, what if your life looked like this? Or what if your business, your motherhood, your whatever it is that you're speaking to looked like this instead? And then it is acknowledging that, yeah, we may not be in that place right now, but that place is possible for you. And I think that just makes people feel so much more empowered going into making a decision. And I personally would much rather work with a new client who feels super excited about what could happen for them than feels, oh, I have to do this because things are so bad. Because that's just, my life is so terrible, or my business is going so poorly that this is my only option. Sure, that makes sales. You can sell to people by making them feel like they're just in a really terrible spot. But that's where copywriting and sales and marketing gets into that icky, gross place that we're not comfortable with, because yeah, it's just not how you want to feel. It's how you want to make people feel.
Right. And I've heard this really interesting concept that's coming up for me is that your copy is received with the intention in which it's created. So,
Absolutely.
and I taught legal writing for college students, and students couldn't even understand how I could understand their tone and receive their tone, and I could tell who wrote their own stuff and who didn't and stuff. So people can really receive that and resonate that when you consistently write things. So I find that really interesting, that if you have the intention where you want to make people feel excited, changing the way in which you create your copy can create that.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the great things about incorporating stories in our content is that really is going at it from a point of wanting to connect with people. Like, you're
Right.
wanting them to get this little window into your life or your business or whatever it is, or what's possible for them. And I
Mhm.
just think that's a really genuine way for
Mhm.
people to get to know you and build that trust with you.
Mhm. Mhm.
And ultimately, that's what's going to lead people to wanting to invest in you and continue working with you, because they feel like they know you. They feel like they can relate to you, that you understand them,
Mhm.
and that they just, especially, I work with a lot of coaches and people in that industry in the online space. And I think, especially if you're hiring someone like a coach to help you through your business or parenting or whatever it is,
Mhm.
you want to feel like you can trust that person,
Oh,
because
yeah.
there's so many people in that space that people have said, oh, I made an investment in this coach and it was terrible because they really didn't do this, or they didn't deliver on what they promised.
Mm.
And so you want to have people know,
Mhm.
yeah, I do things differently. You can trust me and we can have that
Mhm.
relationship.
Yeah, I think in the online space, period, trust is so important. And I was thinking too, I was at a recent conference where somebody was talking about storytelling, and he he told us a bunch of facts about anxiety, and we're like, okay. And then he told us a story about how he had a panic attack on a plane, and his process by which he healed that anxiety and was able to fly again. And that story so resonated with us compared to the factual presentation. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, it's just so hard to get there. I don't know.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's just this totally different way of thinking, that I
Mm-hmm.
think it's really exciting that you just have us considering that at this point, right?
Yeah. And I think too, it's important people get overwhelmed with, oh, that's storytelling feels so vulnerable and overwhelming. But you
Right.
don't have to start with talking about this life-changing panic attack that you had, or you
Right.
don't have to start with talking about, or ever talk about, if you don't want to, talk about your children or your partnership or
Yeah.
your childhood. Or like, you don't have to open up the door to every story going on in your life. It can
Mm-hmm.
be like these little micro moments or micro stories that you learned something from.
Mm-hmm.
I have a client who works in customer experience, and we use a lot of stories in her business because every time you go somewhere, if you go to Starbucks and you learn something about customer experience, you go,
Mm-hmm.
through the line at Target and everything is all automated with the self checkout and it's terrible and takes forever. And it's actually worse than just dealing with a human. And there's a lesson there about over automating your online business or things like that. So you can look for these little moments of, what did I learn from this? Or how does
Mm-hmm.
this connect with my audience? And you
Mm-hmm.
can just tell these little teeny stories that don't
Mm-hmm.
gets super personal and feels like you're letting people in more than you're comfortable with. And I think I'm also an introverted person,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like we get this fear of, I don't want to just open up every part of myself to
Mm-hmm.
my audience. And that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. You don't
Mm-hmm.
owe your audience everything about your life. That's
Mm-hmm.
not, you don't have to do that. That's not how you
Right.
have to connect with people.
So I'm hearing we don't have to overcomplicate it and we don't have to be super vulnerable.
You don't have to. And I think the more you tell stories, like, then you may have a
Uh-huh.
more vulnerable thing that happens that you want to share,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have to. I think
Yeah.
people look at it as a all or nothing. Oh, if I'm going to tell stories, I'm going to have to talk about all the things, or I just can't
Uh-huh.
do it. And it's not really an either or. Like, it can be
Yeah.
smaller things. You could tell a story about, I rewatched this episode of Schitt's Creek for the 10th time last night, and this time something clicked this way, or this really
Mm-hmm.
made me laugh and made me think of this thing. It doesn't even have
Yeah.
to be about you per se.
Yeah.
It could be, again, about a client transformation. There are stories in your testimonials and your clients' journeys with you. Although I
Mm-hmm.
will say, like, the caveat of, if you're talking about someone else, unless you're really changing like the specifics of it,
Mm-hmm.
I would always get permission before you share someone else's
Oh,
journey and
sure.
story too.
Yeah, and I don't know, you're obviously an entrepreneur, but I, as someone who helps people with their businesses and their confidence, I constantly see little things that I am now realizing that I could tell a story about.
Mm-hmm.
Because in my daily life, like you said, I was in an event this weekend and I was like, I thought of like so many different things. I'm like, this, if they would make this tweak, this would be so much better. You
Right.
know?
And you can tell those things also and be vague about the details
Right.
so that
Yeah.
you're
I'm not gonna be
not like
like,
encroaching on
yeah,
someone else's privacy or
right. Oh, yeah,
but yeah,
totally.
there's things all the time that you're like, yeah, I could learn something from that, or
Mm-hmm.
there's a teachable moment there. And I feel like,
Mm-hmm.
again, going back to being a teacher, and I do this as a parent too, my kid hates it, but I'm always like, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from this? And he's like,
Right.
I hate that question. I hate it. But it's like how I think my brain approaches things.
Uh-huh.
And that's where you're finding those stories. Something
Mhm.
happens and you're like, what can I talk about here? Where's the teachable moment here?
So I think so much of what we talked about has been about like attracting new clients, but
Mhm.
storytelling can also help us retain the current clients we have. So how does that
Mhm.
factor in?
So I think it's just continually building those connections and
Mhm.
deepening those connections.
Mhm.
For me, I'm always learning more about my clients and more about their stories, because then I'm turning around and creating copy from our content from those things.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think just telling stories, continuing to be relatable, like when you're sending an email to your list, maybe it's someone who has bought from you before, and then they're still staying on your list just because they love those emails that come in and you're sharing things. And
Mhm.
then you're top of mind for them when they want to invest again. And they're like, oh yeah, I did buy something from this person before, and now she's offering this, or I really need this again.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just a way to maintain those relationships and connections with
Mm-hmm.
people.
And just nurture that relationship, it sounds like.
Just
Yeah.
continue to foster that trust and that feeling of, oh yeah, I know that person. I
Mhm.
understand what they're about and how they're showing up.
Yeah. So, what are some of the ways in which we can infuse copywriting on our websites? Because those are so important in the online space. How can we sprinkle that in, like our brand values, which we could probably have a whole podcast episode just on that?
Yeah.
So, yeah, what are some of the essential elements that we should be thinking about when we're trying to create that optimized website?
Yeah. So you want your website to be very easily readable for people. Like you want it to be both like have moments where you're sharing stories, but you also want your website or your sales page or whatever it is to be very skimmable for people. So you want to think about when you're creating those headlines or those high level points for people that they can run down your page and get a sense of who you are without reading every single word, because most people don't have time for that. Maybe if they're super interested and they're like on the fence about, is this the person for me? Is this the person for me? But you want to make sure that you're really giving people a sense of who you are and how you can help them at those high level places, like the above the fold, quote unquote. Like when they first open your website, they should have a really good sense of who you are and how you're showing up just in that first little section before they even scroll down. Or if they are scrolling down, those headlines need to connect together for them very easily and very quickly. And if your brand values, like, yes, people think about having on their about page or something, here are the things my business value. I value very clear communication, or I value authenticity, or whatever it is that are how you show up. But those things can be infused in the kind of copy that you have throughout your site. If you really value clear communication, when it comes time to telling someone how they work with you, have very clear steps of, you can book a call with me. This is step one. On the call, we're going to do XYZ thing. After the call, this is what happens, or this is what giving people those clear steps shows them that you value clear communication. So there's ways to incorporate how you want to show up in the kind of words and things that you have on your website.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating to think about. And really just thinking about from A to Z, how your website comes together and leads to all of these different elements. So, how can we also incorporate those personal experiences on our websites and in our copy that doesn't feel salesy? Because I guess with the storytelling, but are there
Mm-hmm.
some tips that that's maybe a misconception that can make it easy for us to infuse those kind of values and concepts we're trying to convey without feeling salesy?
Yeah, I think certainly when it comes to your website, people think about their about page is where you want to have your story, how your business came to be, or how you are showing up in your business, what's influenced the kind of coach or service provider or whatever it is that you are. So that's a great way to incorporate who you are without feeling like you're selling to people. Like it's
Mhm.
not about making a hard sale at that point. It's
Mhm.
about, this is who I am and how I'm showing up and how I can help you. And I think even when it comes to your work with me page or your services page or whatever you're calling it on your site, showing people that customer journey or that possibility for them too. Again, saying this is where you could be. And again, that doesn't feel like we're selling to someone or saying, do you check all of these boxes? Or all of these things going wrong in your life or your business? This is the transformation that you can have, and taking them on that journey is a really great way to infuse those storytelling elements into your site and make it feel more about connecting with people than about selling to them.
So, yeah, I think that sounds great tips. I know this is sometimes a little bit of a hotly debated topic in the online space, but do you have a recommendation on the number of pages or that you should have in the menu? And do you have an opinion on what someone should call their quote unquote services page? Because I know that there are definitive opinions about that.
Yeah. So I think when you're talking about a coaching business or a service provider business, that having the standard, you want to have your home page, which has the most, that's the hardest page to write for me. Like when I'm creating my own site or writing for other people, like so much goes into the homepage because it's pointing people in other directions. And
Mhm.
that's what people land on first, right?
Mhm.
That's your first impression. So you want to have a really great homepage. I also think you should always have some kind of about page, whether it's
Mhm.
more focused on you as the business owner or about your business or your team, depending on if it's just you as a solopreneur or if you have a team of people that you're working with, introducing those people. And then having some sort of contact page where people can learn how to get on your email list, learn how to apply to work with you or book a call with you or whatever it is. And then, of course, you have the services, the work with me, work with us. I personally like work with me because I feel
Mhm.
like it's that invitation of like, how can I serve you and help you? Of course, services conveys that too. It just feels
Mhm.
more formal to me, but I think it's fine either way. Like
Mhm.
I don't think you need to get too hung up on what that word is, because as
Mhm.
long as you're being clear, like people know what work with me or work with us or services mean. Like when they go to your menu and they see that listed, there's not a question mark of, oh, what does this mean? Or what would I go here for?
Mhm.
Because more than anything on your website, yes, you want to connect, you want to be clever or show your personality in places, but you want to be really clear too,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to your menu and those high level things. Like it's just important that people know where they're going and how to easily find it, because people
Mhm.
aren't going to spend a bunch of time looking. We want to go too fast in our lives and our brains move too fast that
Mhm.
we're not going to spend a ton of time puzzling something out. We need to know
Yeah.
what it is. Same things when it comes to like your call to actions and things on your page. You want to be really clear where you're sending people, what their next step is. And that's a big problem on a lot of people's sites. That's where people get hung up of they're trying to point people in too many directions or be too clever with the call to actions or whatever. At that point you need people to know, what do I do next and how do I do it?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind. If anything, is just making it simple to know how to do the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah, we've talked about not overcomplicating it. We've talked about infusing stories that don't necessarily have to be too vulnerable, especially as an introvert or a mompreneur who may not want to share every detail about their family.
Right.
And we've talked about ways that we can infuse, you know, those concepts we want to convey in our copy and in our websites. So, are there any other pitfalls that maybe mompreneurs are falling into when they're creating their copy that we haven't talked about?
I feel like that hits a lot of the high points. I think one of the other things that I do here, especially with mompreneurs when creating content, is just that they're afraid to create content in their business. They don't know how to show up or if they're showing up in the right way, or they feel guilty if they're not being super consistent in creating content. And I think For the most part, we have to remember no one is paying more attention to you and what you're doing than you are. Like other people aren't judging us the way that we are judging ourselves. So if you try a certain kind of content, you try a story and it falls flat, you're probably the only one who noticed that. If no one really, engaged with this particular post, or one email didn't get as many clicks as you wanted it to, or
Mhm.
whatever it is, I think it's that not feeding into the, oh, then I can't write, or I don't know how to connect with people, or what's the point in me creating this content if people aren't interacting with it? We just have to remember that we are judging ourselves much more harshly than other
Mhm.
people are judging us. And so it's
Mhm.
just you keep trying, you keep seeing
Right.
what resonates, what lands.
Mhm.
Also, you don't have to reinvent the wheel with every piece of copy you create. You
Mhm.
can tell similar stories, you can share similar things with your audience multiple times because they're consuming so many pieces of content. We see
Yeah.
so much stuff, and it takes our brains multiple times of seeing the same thing to
Yeah.
register it sometimes, or to remember it. So you
Mhm.
may feel like, oh, I'm just saying the same things over and over again, or I'm just telling the
Mhm.
same kind of client stories over and over again. But that's what your audience needs. Like they
Mhm.
need to recognize, oh, yeah, she's the person who talks about this thing, and see it
Mhm.
over and over again, so that when they get ready to hire a business coach, a
Mhm.
bookkeeper, a copywriter, a web designer, whatever it is,
Mhm.
you're top of mind for them because they've seen that from you over and
Mhm.
over again.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I heard somebody talking about the fact that they were on Oprah years ago, but they still incorporate this post every once in a while that they were on Oprah. And she
Mm-hmm.
said it never fails that somebody will comment or reach out to her. You were on Oprah?
Yeah.
She's been telling that same story for years. But yeah, it hits home with what you're saying. It might feel repetitive, but that's definitely something that your audience needs to hear. And then too, I think it's important too. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but just because something doesn't get a lot of traction doesn't mean that it's not effective either.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think 90% of your audience may not even comment. Like they see
Right.
you, but you don't have any ability to understand that. And
Right.
it's, I think a lot of people are nervous or it feels vulnerable to comment on a post or to even
Mm-hmm.
like a post because then somebody's going to know I liked it. And then what does that
Mm-hmm.
say? So, yeah, I think it just takes a lot of confidence on your part to know that you're creating content that your audience needs to hear. So,
Yeah. And just keep showing up and keep trying. And there are people who are seeing what you're putting out there. I think about the number of posts that I've read or whatever that I never commented on or even liked or whatever it
mhm,
was, but I remember what someone posted. Or I
mhm,
think about it when I see later, oh, yeah, I remember seeing a post about such and such
yeah,
a thing. Let me read more about it this time. Or again, it's that building trust of people
mhm,
seeing you show up over and
mhm,
over again.
mhm.
But yeah, it's hard. Like I say this as advice to other people. It's hard for me though, if I like spend all this time with making this what I think is like an amazing carousel post for Instagram, and then it gets 2 likes, and you're like, well,
Right.
that was a waste of 45 minutes in Canva. So I think you just have to give yourself a break and know that people aren't judging you. They're not, if they are, those aren't your people anyways.
Yeah.
Like, if
Right.
there is someone doing that, that's not who you want to work with. So,
Yeah. No, I love that. And it's so true. We're coming up against time, and you have given us so many great tips. And I think it's just so exciting to think differently about what we're writing.
mm,
And I think that every time we go to communicate with our clients, it's a new possibility. So I love how you framed that. So, for our listeners, if you want one thing to stick with them or a few kind of concepts to stick with them from our conversation, what would that be?
Again, just to try and put yourself out there. If storytelling is something that you haven't done in your content before, give it a try. Like just start somewhere small, start somewhere that feels easy. Talk about maybe you're telling a story about, like you were saying, the conference that you went to, learning something from hearing someone else speak. Like
Mm.
that doesn't feel super vulnerable. That's not opening up a
Yeah.
part of your life or telling
Mhm.
people anything about you necessarily other than you went to a conference, but
Mhm.
it find these ways that don't feel as scary to
Mhm.
start with something. Like
Mhm.
you don't have to start storytelling when you're ready to tell the most vulnerable parts of your journey. Like you can
Mhm.
start with the easy, like softball kind. We're not jumping in the deep end. We're just going to start
Mhm.
with something that feels easy, that feels accessible to people. So I think that's giving yourself a break. I think that's something that as moms, as entrepreneurs, as women, like we're so hard on ourselves, and just give something a try and
Right.
just keep trying and keep showing up and knowing that you're learning things even when something falls flat.
Oh yeah, and it's so true. It's all or nothing. It's we don't tell stories or we've got to write the novel. You
Mhm.
know?
It
It's
just feels overwhelming when you put that
yeah.
much pressure on yourself, and it doesn't have to be
Mhm.
that way. And I think something that makes like telling a story easy for me is I don't put all the pressure on when I sit down to write my content, doing everything right then. If I encounter something that I think would be a good story later, I will send myself a Voxer about it, or I will send myself an email and then have a folder in my inbox where I drag and drop those emails to, or have it automatically go to that folder. Just as you are coming up with things and thinking of things in your daily life, go ahead and make that note for yourself somewhere so that when you actually sit down to write the email or write the post, you're not sitting there going, what was that I thought I would talk about? Or what can I
Mhm.
write about today? Give yourself some, like a log of things or a library of things that you
Mhm.
can go back to later and pull things from.
Yeah, and it sounds too like we need to also think about repurposing our
Oh,
content.
yeah.
And like you said, so not reinventing the wheel, taking it easy on ourselves.
Yeah.
You're asking a lot, Jennifer. No.
Be nice to yourself.
Yes, I know. No, those are such awesome tips. I am sure that listeners are gonna want to connect with you and learn more about your services. So where can they do that?
So my website is jenniferdewittcopy.com. And then I'm also on Instagram, is probably the social that I'm most active on. And my handle there is Jennifer DeWitt Copy as well. So you can find me either place. I would love to connect and shoot me a DM or whatever. Follow me and I'll follow you back and just see what's going on with people. But yeah, I would love that.
Awesome. I love that. And I will leave those links in the show notes. It's been wonderful talking to you. You have helped me, like, my brain is going right now. So I'm sure that is happening for listeners as well. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insight today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.